Dear learners, in this session we will discuss about disaster and development. This topic comes under the BPAG 171 disaster management. In the topic itself you should know that what do you mean by disaster and development. In this session we will answer about how whether the disaster leads to development or whether the development leads to the disaster. So before beginning, we all know that in earlier time, that natural disaster, we always used to say natural disaster as an act of God, and it's a beyond human control. And when the disaster happens, it used to cause death and damage to the property and revenue losses also. If you look into that closely, there is a close link between disaster and development, because disaster creates destruction and obstructing development initiative. On the other hand, it gives rise to development opportunity. Like for example, if you look into that coastal areas, when the coastal areas, earlier people used to live in the thatched house, and that they used to live in the very vulnerable areas, and they doesn't have a proper frontier also. Now the slowly that development opportunity has come, that they have started constructing in a proper housing system, cement and proper roof and all. Based on that development activity, that vulnerability of disaster has been reduced a lot. So when you are when you are constructing a house, or when you are developing infrastructure, and when you are doing constructing new thing, you always keep in mind that you need to proper planning must be incorporated in the construction activity. Then only that development will reduce the impact of disaster. You all know that disaster result in disruption of your normal life. It used to bring enormous suffering. It used to bring loss of life and property. So what used to happen based on that global efforts, they used to bring the consider about the recovery, rehabilitation. So that is an opportunity to build back better and integrating disaster into development measures and community to resilient to disaster. So when you are suffered from disaster, then the global efforts used to make, they used to proper the reconstructing the building, and they used to bring the recovery and the rehabilitation in an effective manner, so that it used to make the community more resilient and all. So what do you mean by resilient? Resilient means you have to bring back the community normalcy. So it's like a before disaster how the community was there. So that's what used to say, when you have a proper recovery, rehabilitation, reconstruction activity, then you can bring back the community in a more resilient manner. So in that manner, now we are going to look into that, how the relationship, what are the interrelationship between the disaster and the development. Initiatives of development get destroyed by disaster. At the same time, it produces the opportunity for development. Okay, if you look into that vulnerability perspective, both may be increased, but at the same time, if you have a proper strategies, then you can decrease the vulnerability also. Traditional approach, as I already mentioned, that natural disaster as an act of God and beyond control. But in the past, most of the development plans were considered without considering the impact of disaster, and without the taking the community viewpoints and plans and reconsideration. But in the event of a disaster, after that, like for example, what they used to do, they have started giving more importance to the community viewpoints, and they are giving more importance to plans, and they have given more importance to how to consideration and also. So if you keeping with the mainstreaming disaster reduction and sustainable development, a package of resilience building plans, and it would be bring a better result, minimize, and you can't completely avoid losses. For example, mainstreaming disaster reduction and sustainable development. So what do you mean by mainstreaming disaster risk reduction? Before 1990s, the disaster management means we used to manage the disaster. Once the disaster happened, the government used to provide the relief package, relief material, and they used to distribute the food material. These are the things that is like completely managed. So after that they have introduced they have concentrated focusing more on the prevention activities. So if you have a proper prevention, then that that losses of disaster is very less. And also in the way mainstreaming disaster risk reduction, instead of managing disaster you just reduce the risk. Okay, you should not, you can't completely avoid the disaster, but you can minimize the risk reduction. So like for example, if you implement any any program, so you just see the component of disasters and all, so you just incorporate everything also. So the relationship between the disaster and the development indicating following themes. One is that vulnerability may increase due to development initiatives, and development initiative may decrease vulnerability, for development initiative disaster as an opportunity. How come the development programs increase the vulnerability and all? The population without the development initiatives are more exposed to natural hazards and other calamities. Like when you are living in your that coastal areas, if you doesn't have any proper cyclone shelter, if you don't have proper housing infrastructure, if you doesn't have a proper lifeline structure, then what will happen? It more exposed to the natural hazards and at the calamities. At the same time, however, if you look into that, it might, this development initiative process itself, it increase the vulnerability of the same disaster. Like for example, it's all related with it. Like disaster management, you can't look into the in a geographical perspective or geological perspective or scientific perspective. It always linked with the poverty, marginalization, overpopulation and vulnerability. So by and large, poverty give rise to vulnerability and all. So what do you mean by think that vulnerability and all? More and more, what used to happen that poor people used to stay in the slopes, in that these kind of a slope prone to landslide areas, and in some time people used to live in the flood prone areas and marginal agricultural land. In the poorer country, mostly like to have a dangerous building stock. Often they doesn't have insufficient resources to enforce it, appropriate building codes, structural design and quality control due to lack of education and public awareness. As you all know that recent, if you look into the recent Turkey incident, that Turkey is one of the developed country only. Even though that sometimes you can't avoid it also. They haven't followed the proper construction plan, or somehow if you have a proper construction plan, you may reduce the losses of life only. You can't completely avoid the disaster. And also you can lack of knowledge. Lack of knowledge, what will happen? Lack of knowledge leads to lack of awareness, and poor education with lack of awareness results into consciousness, which often increases the vulnerable people may simply unaware the option available to for the vulnerability reduction due to the lack of awareness and the education programs and all. What do you mean by lack of knowledge and lack of awareness and lack of education? The government has made the compulsory, you have to register your plan in your concerned panchayat raj municipality or municipal corporation and all. Like poverty stricken people are there, they used to have a fewer assets, invest in resources, so this also increases the vulnerability. They that they doesn't have proper resources to organize to reduce the risk also. Moreover, after the disaster, it used to starvation and chronic sickness, and it also leading to the newer risk for the people. For example, you can take that urban development. Urban development leads to an inflow of comparably low income groups with a large scale settlement on marginal land and high density, poor quality housing and all. So buildings could also be sited in earthquake fault, in flash flood zones, or slope or at risk of landslide. And another development is the transport and other construction activity. So without awareness about the environment, often result in deforestation and increased risk of landslide also. If you take into the marine and coastal development, okay, marine and coastal development, people lead to population consolidation. So it used to leads to high winds and storm surge. People used to get vulnerable to the landslide risk and flash floods and all. The same way, tourism development can increase potential vulnerability substantially if they have a proper, like for example, when the Indian Ocean tsunami has happened. So these are the things used to be happen. So you have to keep in our mind also. And water resource trap project, such as you can say that dams and irrigation schemes. Also, it increase the risk of floods and slope instability or dam failure. And when you have a dam, it used to improve the agriculture irrigation schemes and all. At the same time, that nearby the dam people used to affect flood continuously, and also if any dam failure happened, that these people also vulnerable to disaster also. In that way, at one stage it is to gives the development opportunity, in another way it increase the vulnerability of the some of the others. And another thing is that investment in poorly managed hazardous interest is, that concentration population around the high zone of plant, exposing the unaware population to high hazard chemicals and industrial disaster also, and livestock development project intensive loss of vegetation cover and leading to desertification and all. So, all the above mentioned example clearly specify the linkages between development and disaster. So, another one is that development programs can decrease vulnerability. Mitigation is the measure to reduce the impact of any disaster. In the mitigation activity, we can say that two kind of activity. One is the structural mitigation, another one is the non-structural mitigation. The structural measures mitigation, it used to reduce the economic and social impact of disaster hazards, involved program construction, particularly dams, terracing, wind breaks. So these are the comes under the structural mitigation. And the non-structural mitigation is it is a kind of a policies and programs, practices, as well as land use policies and zoning and crop diversification, building codes and methods for prediction and warning. So these are the comes under the non-structured mitigation. In a wider context, you can say that non-structured mitigation may include like awareness, education, environmental understanding, community organization, then employment strategies. So these are the comes under the non-structural mitigation. And another thing is to say World Bank has been suggested the some kind of a guidelines also. Okay, they have suggested that operation should be based upon the long-term development perspective, not a temporary relief. Temporary relief in the sense immediate after the immediate disaster they used to provide the food, water and health and these are the facilities to be temporary relief. So when you are focusing upon the relief and the recovery activity, you have to give the long term development perspective and all, and the perspective of the economic return should be high, and the effects of emergency, okay, you have to focus on, and triggering the emergency also, that low probability of happening soon again, and the need for the urgent response should be evident, and you have to give emergency landing is limited cases, effective action can be built into the 2 to 3 years. And there was a, when you are doing the relief and recovery activity, some prospect for the future reduction in the hazard and all. And another thing is that when you are giving opportunity, development opportunity, or sometime often missed or compromised because excessive focus upon the relief assistance. It always used to happen when you are, when you have a real, that time, you always give more importance to the relief assistance only. So relief assistance introduced in a substantial flows of resources into small community, which could also be purchased locally. So the method of incorporating these resources are always like a free distribution through inappropriately chosen local structure may discourage entrepreneurship and all. So another one is that development of physical and economic infrastructure. So this is the more important. So if you see with reference to physical infrastructure, particularly in relation to disaster, the nature, type, and quality of housing area of relevance. Housing infrastructure needs to be planned for the particular environment of the area also. There may be an area first before that you have to see whether it is a flood prone area or the mountainous region, because when you are in a mountainous region you are prone to the landslide and also, and the same way housing have been has to be accordance with the requirements of the area, and you have to see the what are the peculiar requirements in the urban area, and you have to follow the earthquake safety measures in the high risk building and urban areas also in the matter. And another important thing is the development of environmental infrastructure. Any discussion if you have a physical or economic or infrastructural development is incomplete without satisfactory emphasis on building environment support system. Okay, if you look into that, there is a close relationship between the environmental conservation and the disaster mitigation. Like for example, you know that there was a, if you start a more industry, you have to follow the environment impact assessment, and you have to get the NOC from the Ministry of Environment and Forest and all. So when you are doing that, you have to be follow these are the concerns also inappropriately. Like for example, human induced activity, like they used to make the natural or negative or positive, they used to make the in the natural environment. There are thousands of lakes, ponds, lagoons, and estuaries and marshes, backwaters, and mangrove swamps. These are the life wetlands also there. You have to taken care of that only. The effective planning and the incorporation of basic remedial measures is an important part of the disaster management. Okay, disaster can hold up by the development by loss of resources, shifting of resources to emergency response, and depressing investment climate, and it used to affecting formal structure also. Sometime what will happen, development increase the vulnerability through dense urban development and development of hazardous site, environmental degradation, technical failures, accidents, imbalance between the natural and social system and all also. So development programs sometimes can reduce the vulnerability through strengthening of the urban utility system, hazard resistant building techniques, institution building, capacitating of local authorities, agriculture and forestry programs. So in that way, you can say vice versa. You can say that sometimes disaster leads to development. At the same time, development leads to disaster also. Sometimes you can consider as the development disaster as an opportunity for the development and all. So thank you for listening.